You expect Pennsylvania to be coal dust and factory whistles, covered bridges and Civil War markers, practical maps, neat county lines, and stories that fit into tidy chapters of a school textbook. But picture this: fog clinging to the fields at dawn, the smell of wet stone rising off a forgotten creek, and an outline of something older than our state flags, older than town charters, older even than the histories we like to repeat. That contrast, between what we think we know and what the land quietly refuses to fully explain, is where this story begins. I promise you, right now, that what follows will ask more questions than it answers. It will take you through 6 distinctive places in Pennsylvania where artifacts, earthworks, bones, and folklore refuse the simple verdict of modern explanation. We will walk old trails together, through peat and bog, across ridges where wind makes a kind of human voice, down into cellars where the rubble eats the light. We will encounter things that make archaeologists furrow their brows, historians trade cautious emails after midnight, and small-town elders lower their voices. We will meet the data, the radiocarbon dates, the measurement tapes, the core samples, and we will also sit with the myths, giants, cursed stones, lost voyagers. You will be invited to imagine, to feel that prickle at the back of your neck when something refuses a final account. This is not a show of certainty. It's a long, patient listening to a landscape that keeps some of its conversations private. By the end, we will not have neat answers, but we will have a deeper curiosity, and perhaps that is the point. For all the maps and all the carbon dating, some secrets still seem to prefer silence. Keep that in mind as you step across these pages. The ordinary can be a cloak for the extraordinary, and the ordinary is often where we'll find the trace of something we do not yet understand. The first place I want you to see in your mind is a ridge that runs like a spine beneath a sky that tends to be gray in the shoulder seasons. You could pass it on the highway and see nothing but trees. You could pass it on a Sunday drive and tell yourself the land is just land. But here is the one-sentence truth that makes people come back at odd hours. A ring of massive stones and earthwork sits on a little-known plateau, aligned to the horizon in a way that no one has satisfactorily explained. Some call it the ridge circle, some call it the old stones. The maps sometimes label it only with a small black square and 3 letters. Its measured diameter is roughly 42 meters, give or take a meter depending on how you count weathered edges and collapsed humps, and that precision matters because alignment and scale are part of the puzzle. Radiocarbon samples taken from charcoal in a shallow pit near one of the stones return 2 clusters of dates, one cluster centering around 1200 to 900 BC and another much later cluster between 800 to 1100 CE. Now, let's be fair, pottery sherds and lithic flakes found nearby are inconsistent and fragmentary, yet suggestive of multiple periods of use. But here's where it gets tricky. The stones themselves are not native to the ridge. They're a hard, fine-grained rock type that only occurs in ledges miles away, across a ravine that would have been a formidable barrier in pre-colonial times. People we cannot definitively name, moved heavy blocks up and across that divide, and placed them in this ring with a precision that speaks to deliberate intention. The surface of one stone, when examined under low-angle light, reveals incisions that might be natural weathering, or they might be marks of tool use, lines repeated in a pattern that suggests human agency. There are trade route hints here too. Small bits of marine shell, not fresh and not beautifully preserved, appear in a stratum that suggests exchange over great distances. Were those shells trophies? Currency? Offerings? The theories multiply. Some archaeologists propose that the ring is a ceremonial center reused over centuries, perhaps a seasonal gathering point for disparate groups who use the ridge as a landmark for trade and diplomacy. Others argue for astronomical function. The ring's gaps and stones line up with summer sunrise and winter sunset along specific points on the horizon, evidence, if we accept the alignments were intentional, of a people who tracked solar cycles. Yet skeptics caution against seeing patterns where the human brain insists upon them. An alignment may just be an alignment, and charismatic stones attract stories that grow like vines. Then there is the sensational thread, the local elder who told an ethnographer in the 1950s that, in his grandfather's day, children were warned never to walk the ridge alone because, on certain fogged mornings, old giants walked the stones. That language of giants recurs in the region's tall tales, an echo perhaps, of a memory of a social class above others, or maybe a mythic compression of landscape memory into moral narrative. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, your breath fogging in the same air that coats those stones, feeling the cold bite of wind against the exposed plateau. You might run your hand along a stone and find the same notch that another hand found 700 years ago. Still, for all the evidence, the provenance of the stones remains unsettled, the true pattern of their placements remains debated, and we still don't know. Move now eastward, into a valley where a small river runs like a ribbon of old glass, and imagine, under a thin layer of meadow soil, a burial mound whose interior has been a private source of argument for generations. The one-sentence teaser for this place is sharp. Beneath a farmer's hayfield lies an anomalous burial, among common grave goods, a size and orientation that don't quite match anything catalogued in regional typologies. The mound itself measures nearly 9 meters across and rises about a meter above the surrounding field. Unremarkable until you look closer at the interior profile recorded in a 1974 salvage excavation. That dig found both plank-lined chambers and a cluster of disarticulated bones that defied expectations. Several long bone fragments measured significantly larger than typical ranges for human remains of the area. Now, let's be cautious with the word giant. Both history and journalism have tangled with sensational claims, and scientific remeasurements in the 1980s scaled some earlier numbers down. Still, the osteologists who re-examined the collection admitted anomalies. Certain femoral fragments suggested robust individuals, with cortices thicker than average and muscle attachment scars that indicated heavy physical activity. Radiocarbon dates on bone collagen returned a mid-range date of circa 500 to 700 C, but dental isotopes hinted at a diet unusually rich in protein and possibly including coastal resources. How did a community buried in a hill inland have coastal food signatures? Trade networks are one answer, but the specificity of isotopic blends suggests not casual trade, rather, prolonged or seasonal contact. Could this reflect a migratory group that seasonally moved between coast and interior? Or might it indicate an elite whose social connections stretched into distant waterways? Competing theories again proliferate. Some scholars argue these burials represent a regional chieftain class with access to exotic foods and specialist labor. A darker hypothesis proposes internecine warfare where captives from distant regions were interred here. There are also fringe ideas. Travelers in the 19th century wrote of bones so large a man could climb them, language that fuels modern myth-making about prehistoric giants. Imagine the scene in your mind. You are at the field's edge as autumn light thins. The farmer's dog snuffles at a tuft of grass, and beneath your feet someone slumbers who once ate fish from the sea and walked a path we have no paperwork for. Still, for all the osteological sampling and isotopic modeling, we still don't know. The next place is a wetland, a black, soft ground where peat hugs the water and preserves things other soils eat. One sentence to hold in your head: a handful of bone, a carved wooden paddle, and a bundle of plant fibers found in the peat suggests ritual activity and, oddly, a set of map-like notches that do not match local iconography. The wetland yielded a particularly intriguing find, a fragment of worked wood about 72 centimeters long, dark with age, bearing notches and incisions along its length that form a repeating, grid-like pattern. Radiocarbon dating places the wood around 2,300 years before present, approximately 350 BC, a time when, according to prevailing regional models, certain cultural groups were transitioning economies and social structures. Nearby lay a set of small stone weights and a scattering of worked bone that, together, satisfy the eyes of an archaeologist looking for domestic tools. But here's where it gets tricky. The pattern on the wood is not merely decorative. Some analysts, after careful photogrammetric study, asserted the incisions might represent a portable mnemonic device, something like a map or calendrical board used in seasonal planning. A competing theory suggests the board was a musical instrument, with grooves worn by repeated playing. If it is a map, what does it map? The incisions do not mirror known river courses exactly, but there is a faint similarity to an ancient channel that silted over millennia ago. If it documents that channel, Then the wood is a snapshot of a landscape shift, someone recording what has since changed. Yet skeptics point out that the idea of a map reads modern purpose into ambiguous marks. Mythic speculation runs wild in local retellings. One folklorist recorded a tale of a stone finder who once struck the peat with such force that the earth coughed up a manstone and a carved board. Town histories sprinkle this with moral lessons about greed. Picture yourself crouched at the peat edge, fingers stained with tannin, the board slippery and cold, trying to translate something from a people who had no written alphabet in our sense, yet had their own ways to commit vital knowledge to durable material. Still, for all the photogrammetry and careful comparative studies, we still don't know. Now imagine traveling to a ridgetop clearing where, amid secondary forest, lie anomalous post holes and an arrangement of copper beads in a shallow cache. This site's teaser, scattered copper artifacts imply a network of exchange more extensive than the settlement's modest architecture should allow. The copper itself is of a composition that hints at sources hundreds of miles away. Trace element analysis suggests or signatures consistent with deposits near the Great Lakes. Yet the settlement foundation dates, derived from charred beam samples, hover around 900 to 1100 CE, centuries before sustained European contact. How did copper move so far, and what social mechanisms carried it? Excavations revealed a surprisingly sophisticated pattern of domestic spaces, rectangular houses with well-laid hearths and storage pits. But the cache, carefully arranged beads threaded on a bone rod, was placed in a pit that looked ceremonial rather than utilitarian. One interpretation: this was a gift exchange hub, a neutral space where groups met and redistributed goods. Another possibility: the beads were an elite marker, a status object concentrated by local leaders to cement alliances. Meanwhile, anthropologists point to parallels in other regions where long-distance exchange fostered social complexity without centralization. But here's where it gets tricky. Nearby, there are rock ledges bearing cupules, small depressions pecked into stone, that align along a path leading away from the settlement and toward a valley with unusual magnetic anomalies recorded by a 2003 geophysical survey. That survey found pockets of soil magnetization that do not correspond to known hearths or metalworking debris. Some researchers proposed underground features, collapsed kilns or post-intensive fires, while others wondered whether natural geologic processes could produce similar signatures. The local teller of tales adds another layer, a century-old story of voices in the valley, reported by hunters who heard drums echo differently there, as if the earth itself were listening. Picture yourself on the ridge, clutching a copper bead the color of old pennies, listening to the wind move through the trees as if telling you a secret no one has dared to decode. Still, for all the compositional analyses and geophysical mapping, we still don't know. Consider, too, a small island in a freshwater lake, barely more than a knoll when water is high, where bones and charred plant residues form a patchwork that resists tidy classification. The one-sentence tease, midden deposits on a low island suggests repeated, perhaps ritual, human use at odds with the island's precarious size. The deposits include fish bones predominated by species common to nearby streams and some rare finds, fragments of obsidian, not native to eastern North America, and a tiny carved stone figurine whose style is hard to place. Dating returns are messy. The shell-tempered ceramics nearby range broadly across several centuries, but a burnt post beneath a scatter of fish remains yielded a precise radiocarbon age of 1350 CE. If the island was intermittently occupied for ritual fish processing or seasonal camps, why introduce an obsidian piece? The most parsimonious explanation is long-distance trade. Raw materials move through networks across the continent. But the figurine persists as an enigma. Its facial rendering is schematic, not aligning neatly with either the valley styles or the distant northern forms with which it shares some features. Some mythic retellings insist the figurine is an island spirit, returned by the lake when certain taboos were broken. Others treat it as an artistic outlier, someone's experimentation with form. Picture yourself standing on the damp shoreline, the air heavy with lake sulfur and the faint metallic tang that obsidian leaves on a finger, feeling the shape of human creativity that refuses easy classification. Still, for all the stratigraphic data and careful stratigraphic recording, we still don't know. Finally, for this installment, travel with me to an unexpectedly mountainous pocket in the state where, carved into a fractured ledge, lie petroglyphs that do not match the iconography catalogued in the archives. Their one-sentence teaser, a sequence of spirals, ladders, and an uncanny human silhouette with exaggerated proportions clusters on a single slab, defying neat typological assignment. The rock's patina indicates great age. Lichen growth patterns corroborate long exposure, and direct dating of mineral accretion suggests some engravings might predate the woodland period. Stylistic comparisons draw only partial matches. The spirals echo motifs found in coastal regions, the latter motif appears in disparate places across the continent, and the elongated human figure, its arms swept into a pose unlike any local dance, feels utterly personal to the carver. The slab sits at the edge of a ravine, where microclimatic conditions preserve both the carvings and a thin scatter of ochre residues. One theory posits the site as a convergence zone where traveling peoples, seasonal hunters or distant voyagers, left markers of passage. Another argues for a specialized ritual space created by a local community that developed a unique visual language. Still, for all the comparative iconography and patination studies, and despite efforts to link the motifs to cosmologies recorded by later groups, we still don't know. We will stop the formal procession of sites here for a moment, not because the landscape is exhausted of mystery, but because the pattern is emerging. In each place there are traces, tantalizing data, sometimes a shard or a spectral radiocarbon datum, and often a folklore thread that either clarifies or complicates the interpretation. Each piece flips between two poles, rigorous scientific reporting and the human need to make sense of wonder. Each segment invites you to picture yourself there, to feel the weather, to imagine hands that carried stones, traded beads, and left notches on wood for reasons we can only hypothesize about. As we move forward in the next portion of the story, you will encounter more sites with similar contradictions, artifacts that suggest wider networks than we expected, human remains that bend the metrics of our categories, and geophysical signatures that do not neatly map onto existing theories. Remember the transitional phrases we used, because they are more than stylistic. They mark the moments when explanation tips into speculation and back again. But here's where it gets tricky. Still, for all the evidence. Now, let's be fair. Those are the hinge points where the story moves, and where you, listening, make your own small judgments about what is plausible and what invites a mythic imagination. The hollow of Whispering Stones sits in a low bowl of land like a secret cupped in a hand. Its story can be told in one line. A shallow valley ringed by outcrops contains stone alignments, and a cache of items that refuse to fit the tidy categories archaeologists prefer. Walk with me through the scene. The hollow is roughly 120 meters across at its widest point, ringed by fractured ledges and a scattered assortment of stones, some no larger than bread loaves, others shoulder height and smoothed by centuries of rain. In one sheltered nook, measured carefully and recorded in an old field report that still lives in a local historical society file, archaeologists uncovered a clustered deposit that included a finely worked blade fragment of a hard black stone, the tip of a bone awl, several fragments of fired clay that appear to be part of miniature vessels, and a handful of copper flakes that when analyzed show trace elements hinting at ore sources distant from the immediate valley. Radiocarbon dating from charred botanical remains recovered in the same stratigraphic context return dates clustering between 400 and 700 CE, but there are earlier and later intrusive finds in adjacent layers that complicate the picture. Now, let's be fair. The hollow has served many purposes over time: an ephemeral campsite, a seasonal hunting stop, a place where children of later centuries might have left marbles, so taphonomy is messy. But here's where it gets tricky. The stone arrangement inside the hollow does not appear random. Several small boulders form a subtle crescent facing a low rise on the eastern rim. When the morning sun rises at a precise time in early spring, a shadow falls through the crescent and touches a flat stone with a shallow carved groove. The groove's smoothness suggests repeated contact, something passed along it many times. Was it a path for offerings? A boundary marker between groups who shared the hollow? Or is the alignment a chance effect of glacial outwash and later human reconfiguration? The data nudges us towards ceremony. The miniatures and the careful placement of copper flakes imply ritual deposition rather than casual discard. Yet, as ever, skeptics point out that human beings often reuse landscape features accidentally in ways that appear purposeful in hindsight. Trade networks appear here too, like threads connecting distant looms. Elemental analysis of the copper flakes places the likely ore source not in the nearest river valley but in a mineral belt several hundred kilometers to the north and west. That detail complicates the image of isolated, small-scale communities. It hints at movement, people, ideas, materials, across considerable distances. Some anthropologists propose a model of relay exchange. Goods move gradually through networks of intermediary communities, rather than by individual long-haul journeys. Others imagine seasonal gatherings, groups coming together at central nodes, exchanging commodities, stories, and genes. Then there are the less empirical, more speculative notions. A regional survey from decades ago recorded a cluster of oral histories about the hollow. An old woman in one town would tell of nights when the stones sang, and a hunter in another township swore he had seen men as tall as pines cross the hollow once, leaving prints that vanished come dawn. These are not data in a lab sense, but they are data in the human sense. They tell us how successive communities have framed and reframed the place. The hollow's ritual hypothesis faces counterpoints in the simplest of ways. The clay miniatures could be children's toys lost during play. The bone awl tip might be a broken domestic implement. The copper flakes may come from a single discarded repair job rather than an imported prestige good. Yet the context of deposition suggests care. The miniatures were deliberately placed in a shallow pit and covered with a light layer of hearth ash. If we accept intentional deposition, the social significance changes. Now imagine a seasonal ritual in spring. Groups gather to renew alliances, to give thanks for returning fish and game, to remember dead kin whose markers were the stones themselves. Picture yourself walking the hollow at dawn, the grass beaded with dew, your breath making small clouds that drift toward the east where the sun begins to scrape the horizon. You kneel and feel the subtle indentation of that carved groove. You run your finger along the copper flakes and imagine the glint they once made in torchlight. Still, for all the stratigraphic records, the geochemical analyses, and the respectful cataloging of oral lore, we still don't know. There is a human instinct, ancient and modern, to explain unusual things with narratives of greatness or terror. In some corners of Pennsylvania, that instinct wrapped itself around a discovery from the 19th century: skeletal remains exhumed from a river bluff that, at the time, were documented as unusually large and accompanied by foreign-looking implements. The brief field notes, yellowed at the edges, were written by an amateur collector who used language at once ecstatic and unscientific. "Bones vast as a common barrel, tools of a fashion not local," he wrote, and local papers printed sensational copies. Fast forward to the present, and the matter returns as a kind of palimpsest: records of early finds, subsequent reburials, and second-hand stories layered upon each other. What made this place compelling to revisit was not only the bones but the location, a meander where a tributary once carved a horseshoe into the bank and exposed deep strata of occupation. Subsequent professional surveys, using more rigorous methods, sampled the bluff and found a sequence of deposits indicating human presence over many centuries, though the skeletal material recorded by the 19th century writer is now lost. Still, the memory remains, embroidered with each retelling. The modern osteologists who examined photographs and remaining notes concluded that the initial measurements were likely exaggerated. People then loved a tall tale, but they could not completely dismiss anomalies. Some of the recorded limb proportions, if taken at face value, would be out of range for the normal human variation documented across the region. Were these the remains of unusually large individuals, perhaps members of a well-nourished elite, or were they merely the products of measurement error and misremembered scales? We must be precise with our language here because myth and mistake often tangle. There were no ironclad confirmations of giant skeletons in the contemporary collections. What exists are ambiguous references and an open question about the representativeness of early collectors' observations. Still, the story matters because of what communities do with it. In towns near the bluff, markers of identity and memory grew up around the tale: a roadside shrine, annual tales at bonfires, a children's game called Giant Step. The myth converts the place into a living social artifact. It shapes how people walk the river and which stories they pass to their children. This is not mere folklore in the academic sense, it's cultural archaeology happening in real time. Imagine standing where the old collector stood, the river hissing against shale, the sky compressed by migrating birds, the soil a layered cake of lived moments. Your hand fits into a groove in the bluff that might have been made by a plow or by a clumsy digger. The question remains which human act is older, and which is the overlay. Still, for all the surviving notes and occasional photographs, we still don't know. At the edge of a town that grew with the railways, there is a reduced and nearly invisible trace, the kind of place that calls to graduate students and late-night toponomists, a linear earthwork, barely a berm today, that surveys recorded in the 1930s mapped as running roughly 600 meters and curving gently along a ridgeline. The one-sentence summation: an earthen embankment of uncertain function may have demarcated space, social, ritual, or defensive, but the artifact spread around it complicates simplistic interpretations. Surface finds include a surprising mosaic of materials: bits of Atlantic shell, a few glass trade beads from early European contact appearing in higher strata, and abundant lithic debitage of locally available chert. The embankment's morphology, its width, the shallow ditch on the inner side in some spots, and the consistency of labor invested, points toward an organized construction event. Who organized it? For what purpose? Some researchers argue for an emergent communal identity, a shared project to create a place that marked group belonging, perhaps tied to seasonal liminality. Others view the earthwork as a defense structure, raised perhaps in response to a period of intergroup conflict. Yet the embankment's shallow character makes strong defense unlikely. Another theory suggests an agricultural function, terracing or drainage, but the embankment's relationship to known arable terraces is tenuous. Complicating matters is the stratigraphy nearby, which records a transition in economic materials right around the time the embankment was likely constructed. There is evidence for increased cultivation of certain plants in the surrounding fields and a shift in tool forms toward more specialized agricultural implements. This could mean the embankment marks a social reorganization tied to the intensification of food production, perhaps a boundary delineating land use rights or ritualized harvest spaces. But the presence of exotic materials, shell, beads, raises the question of status. Was this community becoming more integrated into wider exchange networks, and did that integration precipitate social changes that required new landscape markers? Picture yourself walking along the remnant berm as afternoon light softens, the air dense with the smell of cut grass. You trace a finger along the compacted earth and imagine people, many hands together, carrying sod and stone in a cooperative rhythm to create something that would endure beyond any single lifetime. Still, for all the mapping and dune coring and artifact analysis, we still don't know. If one pattern should emerge from these 6 sites, it is that Pennsylvania's ancient landscapes are palimpsests, places where successive human acts, natural processes, and memory writing practices layer and erase one another in turn. You will find clear data, charred seeds, radiocarbon dates, trace element signatures. You will also find the human things that do not reduce easily to charts: myth, memory, rumor, the way a town grows attached to a story of giants or singing stones. These elements together produce a mesh of evidence that invites multiple, sometimes incompatible, readings. The skeptic will point to taphonomic complexity, to intrusive finds, to the seductive human tendency to pattern seek. The romantic will point to the continuity of care, the groove on the stone, the covered pit of miniatures, the careful placement of beads, as an index of meaning that survives the reduction of carbon dating. Both are necessary. As we stand at the edge of these places, we ask the same set of questions anew: who moved these stones and why? Who ate the fish and then lay down in a mound underground? Who carved a board that may have been a map or a songbook? Who strung precious metal into a cache and left it under a post, and why did someone later cover it with ash? These are large questions because human lives are large, they involve trade and violence, religion and play, accident and intention. Picture yourself in each scene: the hollow with its groove, the bluff with its vanished bones, the embankment with its shared labor. Let the images sit in your mind like charcoal dust. As you imagine, remember the connective tissue that binds these stories: movement, of objects, of people, of ideas, and the human habit of making the landscape legible. Many of the anomalies we find are best understood within frameworks of mobility. Trade does not have to equal long journeys by single merchants. Exchange networks are often patchworks of many small movements that, over time, link far-flung places. Ritual practices can create transportable meaning. A carved board or a figurine can be portable theology, moving with people across seasons and regions. Still, for all the convincing models and clever geochemistry, these sites keep a stubborn seat empty, the thing that explains everything. We still don't know. There is a place, almost suburban now at its edges, where the old quarry cuts into a ridge, and the exposed bedrock shows veins and fractures like the lines on a weathered palm. One-sentence truth: sondage work and magnetometer sweeps here revealed anomalies that do not match simple kiln or hearth signatures, and a scatter of work stone that suggests activities we do not fully understand. The quarry face itself is a cathedral of striated stone, once blasted and quarried for building foundations, now a cross-section through time. Within the rubble at the base, careful excavation in the 1990s turned up an assemblage that puzzled field teams: a narrow bed of charcoal-stained soil containing small, deliberately broken pieces of fine-grained chert, tiny polished bone toggles, and a concentration of magnetically anomalous deposits that on initial readouts looked like hearths but lacked the usual heat-affected mineral signatures. Geologists and archaeologists met in the field with caution. The anomalies might have been produced by lightning strikes, or by heating events long enough ago that their usual markers had altered beyond quick recognition. Yet chemical assays of the soil revealed elevated levels of manganese and copper in discrete pockets. If human agency produced the anomalies, what activities could concentrate such metals without the telltale vitrification of a high-temperature kiln? One hypothesis introduced in peer discussion suggested ritual heating, controlled, low-temperature fire used for dyeing or for softening plant resins, activities that leave chemical traces but not the glassy slag we expect from metalworking. Another explanation offered was natural. Groundwater percolation over specific mineral veins concentrates certain elements in pockets, mimicking anthropogenic patches. But here's where it gets tricky. Embedded among the stone breakage patterns were flakes of exotic minerals not native to the immediate geology. Tiny slivers of a dark, glassy material that, when examined under magnification, showed conchoidal fracture and a translucence reminiscent of obsidian. Obsidian in this region is a rare find. Its known sources lie hundreds of kilometers away, and its presence usually signals exchange or travel. The field teams cataloged the flake pieces as possible tool-making debris, but their working surfaces showed where patterns inconsistent with cutting meat or scraping soft hide. Instead, several bore micro-polish suggesting ritual handling or use in fine-grained tasks like scoring plant fibers. The local oral record ties the quarry to a myth of the fire beneath the stone, an old story in which a woman struck rock and heard an echo that answered her name. Such a tale might be poetic nonsense, or it might be the cultural echo of complex human engagements with peculiar landscapes, practices we cannot fully reconstruct. Picture yourself standing at the quarry edge as a late sun lowers, the exposed bedding planes catching a copper light. You squat among the displaced boulders and pick up a flake that still carries a whisper of purpose. Still, for all the geophysical readings, microscopic polish analyses, and careful site formation studies, we still don't know. In a marshy bend of a river where cattails crowd and dragonflies make needle stabs at the air, divers decades ago found what the newspapers called the Sunken Road, a series of submerged post-impressions and paving stones lying beneath silt, curving across what was once dry land. The simple teaser is taut: a submerged linear feature, partially preserved beneath river mud, hints at deliberate construction in a landscape since altered by shifting channels. Underwater archaeologists used coring and sidescan sonar to map the feature, an arc of compacted stone and wooden stakes running roughly 80 meters, with occasional clusters of artifacts concentrated along its edges. Radiocarbon dating of waterlogged timbers gave an aged cluster around 1400 to 1600 C, late pre-contact and early contact centuries. The construction technique unusual in the region, interlaced wooden planks laid upon stone pads and stabilized with peat bundles, an engineered surface meant to bear weight across a seasonally wet landscape. Nearby, divers recovered a small cache of objects, a set of 3 tiny blades fashioned from flaked black stone, a bone button decorated with incised zigzags, and most strikingly, a sliver of green glass that, by composition, seemed not to be European bottle glass but a heat-altered silicate with trace elements more akin to materials traded across inland networks. That glass flared questions. Did someone bring a foreign object across land routes and deposit it ritualistically in the marsh? Or did currents rake away trade goods from later wrecks and concentrate them in the river bend? Now, let's be fair, rivers move things, and contexts get mixed. But the intentionality of the road itself suggests that people engineered the wetland for specified travel or ceremonial movement. Some archaeologists propose the Sunken road was a processional way, used seasonally to access sacred marsh islands, where offerings were left in watery caches to ensure bountiful fish runs or to appease river spirits. Others see a practical cause, a transport route built to move heavy loads between seasonal camps when the main valley paths were impassable. Then there is the mythic thread. A local elder told a recorder that, in his youth, his grandmother spoke of a ladder in the river, used by the water people, an image that conjures doorways between worlds. Picture yourself ducking beneath a green surface, the beam of your light catching a plank edge and then sliding across the glossy curve of that odd glass sliver. You feel the weight of a hand that once walked that line and the cold knowledge that landscapes shift and bury their histories. Still, for all the dendrochronological sequences, the stratigraphic mapping, and the comparative ethnography, we still don't know. These places, quarry faces with their magnetic riddles, marsh roads that speak of engineering in the wetland, are not isolated curiosities. They knit into larger patterns that keep tugging at our sense of how people lived here long before highways and municipal boundaries. One pattern is the presence of material that traveled far, stone from distant ledges, marine shell in interior mounds, bone chemistry that hints at coastal diets and inland burials. Long before cars and trains, people moved things across the landscape in complex, sometimes seasonal circuits. Another pattern is ritualization of particular microlandscapes, a hollow, a ridge, a marsh, spots that communities repeatedly visited, altered, and imbued with meaning. Ritual leaves marks that are not always easy to distinguish from everyday discard. The same deliberate placement, if interpreted in the wrong frame, becomes trash instead of offering. Still, for all our models, relay exchange, seasonal aggregation, ritual focal points, there remains a stubborn residue of the unknown. We can measure isotopes and map magnets, but the inner life of the people who made these choices resists quantification. Why choose that stone? Why bind a carved board with fibers in a particular knot? What song accompanied the placing of beads in a pit? We have ways to approach these questions: experimental archaeology, ethnographic analogy, chemical proxies, but we do not have a complete translation key. As you listen, notice how the land itself has its own tempo and logic that shapes human action. Rivers change course, bogs deepen, forests rise and fall with fire and frost. When archaeologists dig, they must learn to read palimpsests. The deeper layer is not always older in a straightforward way once human action and natural action mix. That complexity sometimes generates stories that become legend: giants shaping stones, singing hollows, water roads leading to other worlds. Such stories are not necessarily false, they are often compressed truth, human memory encoding repeated features of landscape behavior into narrative. Imagine a child who learns that certain marsh patches are dangerous after seeing horses sink. That child's memory, retold in dramatic form, becomes a myth about the river swallowing a road. The transformation from observation to myth does not erase the observation, instead it gives it a social life. Still, for all the interpretive tools we bring, from microbotanical analysis and magnetometry to oral history collection, we still don't know. We must pause for a moment to reckon with what, not knowing, asks of us. It asks for humility, an acknowledgement that a scientific catalog of all the data does not automatically produce a singular human story, but it also asks for imagination tethered to evidence. When fieldwork yields an odd blade, a peculiar bead, or an alignment of stones, we do not get to invent entire civilizations to fit those traces, nor do we get to dismiss them as mere noise. The responsible path is to situate anomalies within the constellation of allied evidence, to test hypotheses, and to allow the landscape to keep its secrets when it must. That refusal to overclaim is itself a kind of reverence. It recognizes that human lives have particularity and that some particularities will remain opaque to methods that seek generalities. Yet there is another posture we must cultivate, the willingness to feel wonder without converting it into certainty. Standing at the edge of an excavation, watching soil come away in thin layers, is to stand near the patience of time. Picture yourself there, hands gloved, brush in hand, the afternoon light softening into gold, and consider how careful the work is, how small the gestures that recover a shard of pottery and return it to meaning. Still, for all the patient recovery and the slow accumulation of data, we still don't know. And so we return to the core question that binds all these places together. Why do these ancient, unresolved traces matter to us now? They matter because they expand our sense of human possibility. They matter because they refuse the vanity of thinking we know how everything happened. They matter because they ask us to be citizens of time as well as of place, to feel responsibility toward past actors who shaped landscapes we now inherit. Each artifact is not only an object in a museum drawer, it is also a prompt to imagine lives analogous to ours in their hopes, their errors, their loves, their fears. When a farmer plows up a stone and brings it into the kitchen as a curiosity, when an elder tells a child about giants, when a scientist runs a mass spectrometer over a charred seed, all these acts are part of the same cultural conversation. They are how we construct continuity. Picture yourself walking these landscapes with a map made both of measurements and stories. Feel the wind as a medium of conversation, see the stones as interlocutors, and listen as if the earth might reply. Still, for all the ways we listen and test and imagine, we still don't know. By now, you can see the pattern as clearly as a river tracing its bed, small things repeated across a broad landscape, stones carried beyond their outcrops, beads threaded and then buried, boards notched with marks that might be maps or songs, add up to a geography that resists simple narration. Each anomaly is an argument against the tidy story that human life in this place followed a single, linear trajectory from simple to complex. Instead, these traces sketch a world of overlapping rhythms, families and bands moving with the seasons, networks of exchange that stitch distant waters together, ritual acts that made places sing for a while and then fall silent, and stories that grew around those actions until memory and myth braided into something new. That braided thing is alive in the names locals still use: the Hollow of Whispering Stones, the Sunken Road, the Quarry of the Fire. But it is also alive in the lab notebooks and the digital data that archaeologists and geophysicists add to a slowly growing ledger. We do not sit on one side of the ledger and the land on the other. We are part of the same account, writing our conjectures in the margins while the land keeps its slow, patient narrative. Think for a moment about what evidence actually does. It tethers imagination to particulars. Without evidence, fanciful stories float, losing contact with the solid impressions of hands and weights and chemical signatures. Without imagination, evidence is lonely, a set of numbers and objects that fail to conjure human life. The sites we visited demand both temperaments. The hollow with its carved groove asks for the patient eye that recognizes deliberate placement. The farmer's mound asks for the clinician's careful measurement and for the storyteller's sensitivity to how legend responds to a real human face in a photograph. The marsh road, preserved in silt, asks that we imagine engineering skill at a landscape scale and that we hold in mind the river's capacity to swallow and reconfigure. The quarry admonishes us with its fractures. Even places of industrial modernity expose older layers waiting for someone to look. Each place refuses to be reduced to a single sentence. Each asks us to hold complexity without succumbing to the twin errors of romanticizing the past or erasing human meaning as mere noise. There is a moral element to this too. When we handle bones and ceramics, When we map magnetic anomalies, we are not merely accumulating curiosities. We are caretakers of a human past that cannot speak for itself. That responsibility changes how one treats evidence. It should make us cautious about the language of giants and curses when evidence is thin, because those words can become weapons, the basis for exploitation, for tourism commodification that disrespects descendants' concerns, or for sensational claims that corrode public trust in careful science. At the same time, an overcorrection into sterile scientism, denying the emotional and spiritual resonances these sites hold for present-day communities, would be a different kind of disrespect. The right posture is both reverent and skeptical, to preserve, to test, and to listen. Part of listening is paying attention to local voices, the elders and storytellers who have inherited oral waves shaped by weather and memory, because they carry forms of knowledge that laboratories do not replicate. Their narratives do not replace isotopes and stratigraphy, but they frame what questions we ask and how we choose to return objects to the earth, or to museums, or to the people whose ancestors may be connected to them. And there are methodological takeaways worth holding before you leave this imagined tour. First, multidisciplinary work matters. Geophysics can point where to dig. Isotope studies can show where people ate and perhaps moved. Microbotanical analysis can tell us what plants were valued. Oral history can point to seasonal places of meaning that might otherwise look like random scatter. Second, context is everything. A flake of obsidian is not interesting by itself. Its significance comes from where it sits, what else is nearby, how the soil layer relates to a hearth or to a burial. Third, humility is the archaeologist's virtue. Sites will yield puzzles, not answers at first. Progress is a slow accretion of small certainties that gradually reshape larger narratives. That is a good thing, because it keeps the past dynamic, never fully claimed, always an argument in progress. Emotionally, these places ask something of us too. Close your eyes and picture the hollow again, not as a point on a map but as a place where a person paused, set down a miniature pot as an offering, felt the cold hard stone beneath their palm, and spoke a name into soggy air. Imagine the quarry worker of long ago, sensing an odd sound under the stone and remembering words his grandmother taught him. Imagine the marsh walker who built an engineered boardwalk and later watched it sink as channels ran their ancient course. These are not distant abstractions. They are intimate, ordinary gestures that accumulate into what we call culture. The artifacts left behind are the stamps of those intimacies, the fingerprints of choices made under weather and hunger and love. That intimacy is why the mysteries matter. They connect us across a yawning temporal span to people who are not so different from us in their small needs and their big questions. The myths, giants, singing stones, water people, serve social purposes too. They encode warnings about safe places, they memorialize trauma, and they name the wonder that people felt without the conceptual toolkit we now bring. Sometimes myth abstracts and enlarges a practical memory. Sometimes it preserves an emotional truth that empirical methods might miss. Both kinds of truth matter. Our task is to weigh each story against the evidence, not to flatten one onto the other, but to let them talk. There will be occasions where the myth leads scholars to a feature that archaeology then clarifies. There will be occasions when a careful excavation deflates a once lively legend, not to trivialize it but to reframe its significance within the arc of shared human life. What of the unanswered questions? We have relayed them already. Why were certain stones moved? Why do burials show unexpected isotopic signatures? Why is obsidian present in interior contexts? What social mechanisms transported copper beads across great distances? But each question opens another. Who are the descendants, culturally and genetically, of the peoples who made those choices? How did climate variations affect routes and resource choices? What rituals were performed at dawn in the hollow, and what songs accompanied them? These questions do not have simple, single-word answers. They require patient inquiry across disciplines, sustained community engagement, and a willingness to change our hypotheses when new data arrives. And yet there is room for imagination, grounded, careful imagination that complements measurement. Picture yourself, one last time, walking these landscapes at different hours and seasons. The marsh in spring when frog song rolls like a low drum, The hollow at autumn dawn when mist slips like silk through the stones. The quarry at late day when the rock seems to glow from within. The island shore at evening when the water mirrors a sky you could walk across. In each scene, imagine hands touching, voices naming, flames marking time. These imagined moments are not inventions. They are empathetic reconstructions that honor the fact that people once lived entire lives in these places. They did not leave behind a tidy ledger because life is messy. They left traces that, when read with care, show that their lives had texture, contradiction, and intention. So, where does this leave us? Not with tidy conclusions, but with a richer set of questions and a clearer sense of what it means to be stewards of the past. These unresolved puzzles are not failures of science. They are its invitations, open challenges that ask us to refine methods, build partnerships, and continually test our assumptions. They ask us to respect the local stories even as we press evidence to light. They ask us to accept the discomfort of ambiguity, because ambiguity is often the raw material of curiosity. And they ask us to feel kinship with the people who left these traces, not because they were mythical giants or inscrutable sages, but because they were humans, pragmatic and spiritual, capable of the same mixture of routine labor and imaginative daring that characterizes us now. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.